You, but first, let's join our political editor, Christopher Hope. Chris, now the dust has settled on the budget, as you'd expect, Sir Keir Starmer making hay, saying the Chancellor is smiling as the ship goes down. But the Conservatives we've been speaking to seem very buoyant. But Chris, has to be said, the reaction amongst the GBNews viewers is tepid, to say the least.
Yes, Martin. Well, I'm here on College Green, and with me is Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Now, his verdict tomorrow will be very interesting for reporters to follow. That's the day 2 of the budget process. Paul Johnson, what's your verdict on the budget?
Well, this was a pre-election budget from a Chancellor who actually had very little space for manoeuvre. The OBR didn't change their forecasts at all, really, and back in November, Mr Hunt was running right up against the limits, his self-imposed limits. So what did he do this time round? Well, it's quite a big cut in national insurance, to be fair. That's a £10 billion cut. Put that together with the cut we had last time, that's worth well over £1,000 for lots of people in work. So that was quite substantial.
4% off it in 3 months.
Absolutely, 4% off in 3 months, worth £1,500 to someone earning about £50,000. But that was the one big thing in this package. He paid for that, a bit of that, by raising bits and pieces of tax elsewhere. Radical change, actually, to the taxation of non-DOMs. We've got a little bit, even less fiscal headroom at the end of the period than we had back in November.
You're spending money based on what the economy is doing in 4 or 5 years' time. Will there be a second fiscal event, maybe in September, pre-November election?
I certainly wouldn't rule out another fiscal event. The forecast might get a bit better. The way this very bizarre fiscal rule works is it rolls forward another year, so that might give him a little bit more room for manoeuvre. So if he thinks he's going to have more room for manoeuvre, he might have another event in September, October, find another 2p of national insurance, and that begins to, well, it's already looking quite significant, but that, he might will help again.
Is it the end for national insurance as a tax? Will you have one income tax in the future?
Well, it's going to cost an awful lot to get rid of national insurance altogether. And don't forget, this is only the employee bit. There's a much bigger bit, which is the bit that employers pay on the pay that they provide to people. That's the big bit of national insurance.
Got some very good
but
emails.
it's very, very striking. For 50 years, all national insurance ever did was go up as income tax came down. And now, over the last few months, we've had this big cut for the first time, I think, ever in the whole history of national insurance.
Our viewers are telling my colleague Martin Daubney, the presenter, it's quite a tepid budget. Would you agree?
Well, it's a budget from a Chancellor, as I say, who had very little space to change. I mean, look, it's worth saying this national insurance change, put it together what happened in November, is a big change. I think the problem for the Chancellor is everyone expected it. It was well trailed, and there wasn't anything much additional in there.
I know you'll be poring over the OBR statement when you get time to, after talking to GBNews and other broadcasters. In there, it does say the OBR thinks that there'll now be net migration up to 315,000 a year from 245,000 a year as the expected figure. Is that surprising to you, given the Chancellor said 3 times they want to grow the economy without using net migration to do so?
Yeah, well, the OBR, of course, is just taking on the higher forecasts that the Office of National Statistics provided a little while ago. Of course, what this means is more people in means probably more tax revenues, but also more pressure on public services. So the very tight public spending numbers the Chancellor has announced are actually even tighter than they look, because they'll have to cover more people.
And just finally, the overview, the economic forecasting, we got anemic growth, but growth this year and going forwards.
Yeah, nothing much has changed in the forecast. It is worth saying the last 2 years have been pretty grim, that national income per person has been falling for 2 years, and we will probably on average be a bit worse off come the next election than we were at the last election, which is pretty unusual, it has to be said. Over a whole parliament, people still no better off at the end of that parliament. The good news is the OBR thinks that inflation's down to 2% very quickly and lower than they thought before, but broadly speaking, a bit of growth into the medium run, but nothing like what we might hope, given how poor it's been recently.
And what will you be saying tomorrow to journalists when you do your famous briefing the day after the budget?
Well, probably much what I've just said to you, and hopefully have a chance to look at some of the more detailed numbers to see what's really going on under the bonnet.
Well, Paul Johnson there, the head of the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, thank you for joining us today on GB News.
Great stuff, Chris. And a tantalising carrot dangled there. There could be another fiscal event, maybe in the autumn. That's what we need, Chris, a big firework as we approach bonfire night. Superb stuff. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, our economics and business editor Liam Halligan has been looking at what Jeremy Hunt had to say and how it affects all of us with On the Money.
This was a relatively low-key